In 1966, there was a young man who loved the Chicago Cubs. He loved them so much, he sued them. See, the Chicago Cubs had a problem. They were losers. And this young fan said, I know why they're losing. He said the Cubs don't have lights at their field, at Wrigley Field. And he had some data. And he said, you know, every time the Cubs would play at home and their eyes would get used to playing in the middle of the day, they'd go on the road to New York or St. Louis, they lost, and they lost a lot. So he said, I'm a shareholder of the company. His grandfather had given him a couple shares of the company, the Wrigley Company, and he sued as a shareholder. He said, you know, I own part of this company, you have to listen to me. So why am I telling you this? Well, underneath all of this is a really important question, a fundamental question for all of us, and that is, who does the corporation work for? Does it work for the shareholders? Does it work for employees? Does it work for customers? Does it work for the executives? I mean, this isn't some arcane kind of businessy thing. This is about employers and workers. This is about you and me. So the program I work for, Marketplace Public Radio, we reported a series on this question, and I want to tell you what I learned. Most important, I want to tell you what I got wrong, the assumptions that I had proven wrong in the course of my reporting. See, I always thought that the shareholders were first, that maximizing shareholder value was the job of corporations in America. And it turns out that hasn't always been the case. I thought employees were always last in line, but that wasn't always the case. It actually changed in the course of my lifetime. I just wasn't paying attention. So I grew up in the awful 70s in Poughkeepsie, New York, middle of nowhere, New York. My dad worked for IBM. The only thing I remember about that time was going to the IBM Country Club. It was a free perk for every employee who worked for IBM. You could bring your spouse, your family, and so we were there all the time, me and my big brother and my parents, and we went to the pool there. Actually, it was the pools. There were two pools. My big brother went to the bigger Olympic-sized pool with the diving boards, and I was with the younger kids at the smaller pool. Temperature was curiously warmer in the water there. You know the story. And that, well, not the pool part, but the country club part, was a picture of corporate America in the post-war years. Kind of the benevolent company. It took care of your whole family from Monday to Sunday, from womb to tomb, as some people put it. If you got sick, the company gave you insurance. When you retired, the company gave you a pension, and at IBM, it also gave you a watch. And that was just kind of how corporations worked. The corporation was the organizing unit of society in post-war America. Those are the words of a business professor named Jerry Davis at the University of Michigan. Right? Life revolved around the corporation. And I want to show you something. This is the General Electric Company in 1953. It put out a tally of where the money at the company goes. And it kind of showed the importance of where they put their money. So after paying the government their taxes and after paying suppliers, 36 cents of every dollar that came in went to the workers. A fair bit of money went to the workers. 1 cent of each dollar went to research, and what was left over, the last 3.9 cents that year, went to the shareholders. So the people who owned stock in the company were explicitly last in line at the time. Workers were first in line, and the stockholders were last in line. And it wasn't just GE, it wasn't just IBM. This was stated explicitly in one way or another at companies like Kodak, Coca-Cola, General Motors. This was kind of how it was. This was kind of a belief system, right? Companies didn't have to do this. In fact, historically, companies did a lot of public things that were beyond their narrow self-interest. Back in the day, companies built canals, they built roads. If you go all the way back to 1600 in the East India Company, they coined currency, they ran ports. So companies had these public purposes, and they didn't have to do it. It was basically a belief system. That's what I learned in the course of my reporting. Basically a fad. They didn't have to do this. And over long periods of time, sometimes fads change, right? They go out of fashion. So I'm in front of you here wearing blue pants and brown shoes. It's kind of a thing now. And I'm quite certain that before long, it's not going to be a thing anymore, right? My daughter's going to say, Dad, what were you thinking? Right? It seemed a good idea at the time. And in corporate America, that seemed like a good idea at the time, was this kind of benevolent corporation with employees first in line. And then it started to change in the 70s because the gold-plated American corporations started to fall apart. Competition from Germany and Japan started coming from overseas, great industrial companies, and our factories started to close or shut down, and the employees started to lose their jobs. And the 70s had all kinds of problems. as you've read or you remember, we had inflation, we had a stagnant economy, we had a big economic slump. So back then, a lot of people talked about stagflation. Another word that didn't really take as much was inflump at the time. But in technical terms, the 70s economically, they sucked. It was a really bad time. And so the great American thinkers of the economy started saying, well, maybe we need a new gospel of what corporations should do. And that gospel was the free market economy. And one of the early preachers was a man named Milton Friedman. You've heard of him before. In 1970, Milton Friedman, economist at the University of Chicago, wrote a very famous article in the New York Times Magazine. And he said, the job of the corporation is to make money. It's not to do all these other things. He said corporations don't have a soul. They're an artificial, the corporation is an artificial person, he said. So its job is not to reduce pollution. Its job is not to reduce inequality. Its main job, those things, he said, are pure socialism. A provocative guy in 1970. He said the job of the corporation is simply to make money for the shareholders. They're the ones who put their money into the company, and if you use the money for anything else, you're wasting these people's money. And so this was kind of a building block of this new church of the free market. And other preachers of this idea started coming on board. Ronald Reagan in the 80s, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was one of these preachers as well. And so suddenly, it became the new belief system, right? This was not something where the new tablets came down from the mountain and people said this is how it has to be. Nobody passed a bill saying this has to be. It was just a fad. It was blue pants and brown shoes. And suddenly we all started to buy into this notion of market thinking got into all of our vocabulary, and we kind of hear it today. I use it all the time today. So instead of learning, I talk about expanding my human capital. Well, use economic terms, right? And expand my network of social capital, formerly known as friends. This is a true story. About a week ago, I caught myself. I was trying to decide whether to eat a cupcake in the middle of the night. And I caught myself doing a cost-benefit analysis of whether to do it. Right? So suddenly all this economic mumbo-jumbo has become English. And that's kind of where we've become now. And so at companies like General Electric, what we found was a lot of the money, because of this obsession with shareholders, a lot of the money no longer went to the workers, a lot of the money went to the shareholders, because we all started buying into this, and we all started kind of joining this church, because it really changed the economy in the 1980s. The US economy took off. Right? A lot of companies grew. The stock market, in the 80s and 90s, it expanded 12 times. And corporate life really started to change. What happened was a lot of the companies started to buy one another. You may remember this if you were around then. These billionaire investors would borrow billions more money and take over entire companies. Right? So if you want to remember that time or to show off to your friends, you can talk about the leveraged buyouts, the hostile takeovers at the time, or better yet, you can refer to the movie Wall Street from 1987. Now, I know a lot of you may not have been around in 1987, but the main scene there was starring Michael Douglas, and he was this soulless investor guy on Wall Street. He had slick back hair and a suit with suspenders, talk about fads, right? And he was at a meeting with all these shareholders at a company called Teldar Paper, but we still had paper in 1987. And in that shareholder meeting, he talked to these other shareholders of the company and said, all these vice presidents here are wasting all your money. You need to change the company, to take over this company, and if you act in your self-interest, everything's going to work out. And the money quote from the movie is when Michael Douglas says, "Greed is good. Greed is right. Greed works." Spoken like a true shareholder sitting in the first pew, right, of the Church of the Free Market. And that's how a lot of the economy changed for us. Shareholders were first in line. So the question is, where were the workers in all this? And life really changed for us because our job security really went out the window, our pensions not so much. And we started to really struggle as the American workers. So this whole corporate social contract that we developed in post-war America started to go away. This whole IBM country club model, it didn't really exist anymore. And you might think, okay, maybe this is just how things have to be. Maybe corporations had to do this to survive, and this is just how things are. But it turns out a lot of critics said this model went overboard. And they're really asking the question is, do we need to change this model? And as they see it, this model, this perhaps obsession with stockholders and the stock price, has resulted in a bunch of disasters that we've seen not too long ago. Disasters like the Enron scandal, the BP oil spill, the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And they say another big trade-off of where we are today is innovation. Like back in the day, patient capital, investing your company money into research for long periods of time, delivered the railroads, it delivered electricity for the country, the internet, breakthrough drugs. And who's going to do that anymore? That's the question. If you're spending all your money or all your focus on investors and the stock price, who's going to do that anymore? So some of the early evangelists of this new church are starting to ask the question of whether things need to change. Harvard Business School in the 80s is where a lot of these ideas were propagated, trained this whole generation of business executives. And at Harvard Business School, the latest issue of the Harvard Business Review is starting to ask, well, do we need a new model here? In my reporting, I met another famous business professor, a contemporary of Milton Friedman's. His name is Mike Jensen, and he wrote a very famous paper in the 1970s. And Mike Jensen argued that the job of the CEO is to serve the best interests of the shareholder. And I got to interview him in the course of reporting, and he said, I think it's gone overboard now. He mentioned it's a story that's been in the news about a drug company that bought another big drug company. And all it did was, the news has come out now, is that drug company jacked up all the prices for the patients, which is great for revenue and great for the stock price, not so good for the patients. And Mike Jensen, one of these early evangelists, said, I don't think shareholders should be at the center anymore. So there's some rethinking, there's some more change that's kind of happening with corporations, what they should do, kind of at the center of capitalism and modern capitalism. So I encourage you to kind of follow it and join this conversation of what are corporations for. Which brings me back finally to the Chicago Cubs. So Bill Schlensky, this young man who sued the company in 1966, he went to court and he lost. The court said, the Wrigley Corporation doesn't necessarily have to listen to this investor, especially this little piddly investor with a couple shares. But in the end, Bill Schlensky saw the Cubs kind of listen to him. More than 20 years later, they installed lights at Wrigley Field in the late 80s. And of course, last year, they won the World Series. And I got to speak to Bill Schlensky. He's still around. He's in his 80s now, this original litigant. And he said, in the end, they won the World Series, and my case turned out to be a winner. Thank you very much.